On the morning of February 27, 2026, in a quiet residential neighborhood on the eastern edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a repairman finished his work inside the home of William Neil McCasland, collected his tools, and walked out the front door at exactly 10 a.m. That is the last confirmed moment anyone can place McCasland inside his own house. His wife returned at noon to find the home undisturbed, the rooms carrying the ordinary silence of a weekday morning, and her husband of decades simply gone. Not gone in the way of a man who had stepped out for groceries, or taken an unannounced drive through the high desert scrubland that stretches toward the Sandia Mountains. Gone in a way that took investigators less than 24 hours to classify as deeply, structurally wrong. The 2-hour window between 10 a.m. and noon is not a gap. It is a surgical extraction. McCasland left behind his cell phone, charging on the kitchen counter with notifications accumulating. He left behind his prescription eyeglasses, without which he cannot read standard print, without which driving at highway speed carries real risk. He left behind his smartwatch, the device that had for years tracked his biometrics, his location, his sleep cycles, his heart rate. Every device that generates a signal, every object that creates a breadcrumb in the digital infrastructure of modern life, was deliberately set down. What he took was specific and deliberate. His wallet, which contained identification and financial access. His hiking boots, the heavy, worn, trail-capable variety appropriate for rough terrain rather than city sidewalks. And a .38 caliber revolver registered in his name. When McCasland's wife called 911 that afternoon, she communicated to the dispatcher something that the responding officers immediately elevated to the lead investigators handling the case. The phrase she used was not speculative or hysterical. It was precise. He planned not to be found. That sentence entered the official record, and it has not left. The Albuquerque Police Department canvassed the neighborhood, pulled traffic cameras, contacted hospitals and urgent care facilities within a 40-mile radius, and initiated welfare check protocols before the sun went down that evening. They found nothing in the immediate vicinity. What they found instead came from surveillance footage recovered from a nearby REI sporting goods store, reviewed in the hours following the missing persons report being filed. The footage captured McCasland inside the store earlier that same morning, before the repairman had even arrived at his house, placing the timeline in a sequence that suggests the departure was planned to the hour. What the footage showed was not a man in visible crisis. There was no erratic behavior, no emotional dysregulation visible in his posture or movement, no conversation with store employees that anyone on staff later recalled as unusual or alarming. He moved through the store with a calm that investigators and behavioral analysts who reviewed the footage later described as purposeful and composed. He made a purchase, the contents of which were not immediately disclosed by law enforcement, and he exited carrying a white shopping bag. That bag was never recovered. Its contents were never officially confirmed. What is known is that a man who had deliberately left behind every tracking device he owned, who had taken a firearm and durable footwear, also stopped at a sporting goods retailer before his disappearance and left carrying supplies in a bag that subsequently vanished with him into the high desert air of New Mexico. The behavioral profile of this disappearance does not resolve neatly into any single category. The removal of electronic devices points towards someone who understood surveillance infrastructure at an operational level. The retention of financial instruments points towards someone who intended to move and transact, not someone preparing for a terminal act in the wilderness. The firearm muddies every clean interpretation. And the hiking boots, practical for the rugged terrain surrounding Albuquerque, for the arroyos and mesa trails that cut through the landscape west of the Rio Grande and east toward the Manzano Mountains, suggest geographic intention. Someone was going somewhere specific. Someone knew what the terrain demanded. That knowledge, that operational literacy about both technical surveillance and physical environment, is not accidental. It is the product of a very specific kind of career. William Neil McCasland retired from the United States Air Force as a Major General, a 2-star flag officer whose career trajectory placed him at the absolute center of American defense technology and classified aerospace research. His final and most consequential assignment before retirement was as the commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. The significance of that posting cannot be overstated. Wright-Patterson is not merely a military installation. It is the institutional home of American aerospace science, the facility where captured foreign technology has historically been analyzed, where advanced materials research programs operate under multiple classification layers, and where the United States military has concentrated its most sensitive aeronautical and space-based research for over 7 decades. The rumors and documented testimony connecting Wright-Patterson to the recovery and analysis of non-human or anomalous aerospace materials stretch back to the late 1940s and have been amplified by recent congressional testimony from credible military and intelligence community witnesses. McCasland commanded that laboratory. He held authority over its programs, its personnel, and its classified research portfolios. Beyond the AFRL command, McCasland's technical background was extraordinarily specific and deep. He served as chief engineer for the Department of Defense's GPS program at a time when that system was transitioning from a primarily military infrastructure into a globally integrated navigation backbone, a transition that carried enormous strategic implications for both offensive and defensive military operations. He managed the Space-Based Laser Project Office, a program operating at the intersection of directed energy weaponry and orbital platform technology, representing exactly the kind of advanced physics application that exists at the bleeding edge of what is publicly acknowledged versus what is operationally deployed. After his retirement from active service, McCasland did not step back from the defense research community. He moved into advisory roles with advanced aerospace research organizations, maintaining relationships and presumably some level of access to the communities and conversations that define the frontier of American military technology. He was not a man who had been out of the loop for years, growing distant from the classified world he once inhabited. He remained embedded, networked, and relevant in the exact communities where the most sensitive questions about advanced technology and its origins were being urgently and newly examined. The timing of his disappearance relative to the federal policy landscape in late February 2026 is not something that investigators or journalists covering the case have been willing to describe as coincidental, even in carefully worded public statements. In the days immediately preceding February 27th, the executive branch had issued a significant federal directive regarding the mandatory declassification and release of military records pertaining to unidentified aerial phenomena. The directive, which built on the legislative infrastructure established by the UAP Disclosure Act and subsequent amendments, specifically targeted historical records held by the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and facilities including Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The scope of what was being ordered declassified touched directly on the institutional domain that McCasland had commanded. A man with his specific clearance history, his specific knowledge of what Wright-Patterson's research archives actually contained, and his specific advisory relationships with researchers actively pushing for UAP disclosure was positioned, at the exact moment of his disappearance, at the center of a collision between institutional secrecy and legally mandated transparency. Whether that positioning is causally connected to his vanishing is a question that no official source has answered. The structural overlap is simply the factual record. Federal investigators from the FBI's Albuquerque field office were brought into the case within the first 48 hours, a timeline that is itself notable given that missing persons cases typically remain under local jurisdiction for a considerably longer initial period before federal involvement is triggered. The acceleration of federal engagement suggested that the nature of McCasland's profile, his rank, his clearance history, and the specific configuration of his disappearance had prompted a determination that this was not a standard missing persons investigation. Search and rescue teams were deployed across the Sandia Mountains and the surrounding wilderness areas. Aerial searches using both fixed-wing aircraft and rotary assets covered terrain east and north of Albuquerque. None of these operations produced a confirmed sighting, physical evidence, or any indication of where McCasland had gone after leaving his neighborhood on the morning of February 27th. The national security community and the UAP research community, which had increasingly overlapping membership rosters by early 2026, began circulating information about McCasland's disappearance almost immediately. His name had appeared in congressional testimonies, in investigative journalism about the history of classified UAP programs, and in documented accounts of researchers who had spoken with former military officials about what was held at Wright-Patterson. His absence was not abstract to people who had known him professionally or had encountered his name in the documentation trail of America's most sensitive aerospace research history. It was concrete and alarming. Within days of the initial reports, the disappearance had generated significant attention in both national security journalism circles and the broader public sphere, but the full weight of what was happening was not yet apparent because McCasland had not yet been revealed to be a data point in a larger sequence. The sequence began to take shape within weeks. Researchers and investigative journalists who were tracking the McCasland case began documenting a pattern that, when assembled chronologically, produces a timeline of deeply troubling convergences. In the period following McCasland's disappearance, a series of individuals whose professional backgrounds touched on advanced materials science, aerospace research, defense contracting, and physics research at the intersection of those fields began disappearing or dying under circumstances that generated significant anomalies in the evidentiary record. These were not household names. They were specialists, laboratory directors, senior research engineers, and contract scientists whose work existed at the classified or dual-use boundary of American defense research. Their deaths and disappearances, taken individually, could each be assigned a conventional explanation. A hiking accident in a remote area, a medical event with no prior documented warning signs, a car accident on a stretch of highway with no witnesses and no mechanical fault identified in the wreckage, a disappearance preceded by no documented mental health crisis, no financial distress, no relationship breakdown, no communication to friends or family indicating any awareness of danger or intention to leave. When these cases were mapped against each other, several structural features emerged that investigators and journalists could not explain away through the application of coincidence. The individuals affected shared overlapping institutional affiliations, having worked for the same defense contractors, attended the same classified research symposia, or operated within the same clearance communities. The timing of the events clustered within a compressed window following both McCasland's disappearance and the federal declassification directive. The methods of death or disappearance in each case involved an anomalous absence of the kind of evidence that normally accompanies such events, whether digital evidence, physical evidence, or witness accounts. And several of the individuals had, in the period immediately preceding their deaths or disappearances, been in contact with congressional staffers, journalists, or advocacy organizations operating in the UAP disclosure space. That last feature, when identified across multiple cases, shifted the analytical weight of the pattern from tragic coincidence to something that demanded a more rigorous structural explanation. The specific cases that investigators and journalists began documenting in the weeks and months after McCasland vanished included a senior materials scientist with documented work history at a defense contractor that held contracts with the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and its successor programs. This individual died in what was initially reported as a single-vehicle accident on a rural highway in the Southwest, with no toxicology irregularities initially noted and no mechanical failure identified in the vehicle. The circumstances of the accident, however, including the absence of skid marks, the location on a straight, dry, well-maintained road section, and the complete destruction of the vehicle's onboard data recording systems in the fire that followed, generated questions that local law enforcement was not able to resolve with the available evidence. A second case involved a physicist whose research background included work on exotic propulsion concepts and who had retired from a national laboratory with a history of classified defense contracts. This individual was reported missing by family members after failing to appear at a scheduled family gathering, with subsequent investigation finding no digital trail after a specific date and no physical evidence of travel, residence, or any transaction after that date. A third case involved a defense contractor employee whose specific role within the organization remained protected by classification, but whose publicly visible professional biography indicated deep involvement in advanced sensor systems and materials characterization technology. This person died under circumstances that a coroner's report described as consistent with natural causes, but which family members and former colleagues publicly disputed based on the individual's documented physical health status in the months preceding the death. These cases, and others that were being added to the investigative record by journalists and researchers working across multiple news organizations and independent research communities, shared the common thread of institutional proximity to exactly the research domains that the Federal Declassification Directive had targeted. The people vanishing or dying were not random selections from the scientific or military community. They were concentrated in a remarkably specific slice of that community, the slice that held direct knowledge of classified programs touching on advanced aerospace technology, materials science with applications to anomalous craft analysis, and the institutional history of how the United States government had managed information about non-conventional aerospace phenomena for decades. By late April 2026, the accumulated weight of documented cases had crossed a threshold that mainstream journalism could no longer treat as a niche concern. CNN ran a substantive investigative report that confirmed what the national security journalism community had been documenting for weeks. The FBI had formally consolidated multiple missing persons and suspicious death cases into a singular classified investigation. The confirmation came through sources described as familiar with the investigation structure, and it was corroborated within days by reporting from the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe, both of which had independently developed sources providing consistent information about the consolidated investigation's existence and scope. The classification of the investigation itself was notable. Formal classification of an active domestic missing persons and suspicious death investigation requires a specific legal and institutional justification, one tied to the determination that the subject matter of the investigation carries national security implications of sufficient weight to restrict public access to the investigative record. The fact that this threshold had been formally crossed confirmed, in the language of federal bureaucratic procedure, that the people responsible for making that determination had concluded that the pattern documented by journalists and researchers was real, significant, and connected to national security equities of a serious order. The political response to these confirmations was immediate and, in several respects, unprecedented in its specificity. Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, who had established himself as one of the most vocal congressional advocates for UAP disclosure and had been a prominent figure in the congressional hearings that had produced dramatic testimony from military and intelligence witnesses about classified UAP programs, made public statements explicitly connecting the pattern of disappearances and deaths to the UAP disclosure process. Burchett's statements were direct and unambiguous in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the careful hedging typical of congressional commentary on active intelligence matters. He identified the pattern as consistent with a program of intimidation or elimination targeting individuals with knowledge of classified UAP-related programs, and he called for congressional oversight hearings that would compel testimony from the intelligence community about what was known regarding the circumstances of each case. The institutional response to Burchett's statements from the intelligence community and the Defense Department was a studied silence that itself communicated something about the sensitivity of the territory being mapped. Donald Trump, whose administration had issued the original declassification directive that had preceded McCasland's disappearance and whose relationship with the UAP disclosure advocacy community had been politically significant in the years leading to 2026, made public comments that acknowledged the disappearances without providing any substantive information about what federal agencies had determined. The comments were notable primarily for what they did not say, for the absence of any reassurance that the federal investigation had identified explanations for the cases, and for the implicit acknowledgement that the pattern was real and warranted serious concern. The contrast between the administration's public posture on UAP disclosure, which had been assertively transparency-oriented in its policy framing, and the silence surrounding the active federal investigation into the disappearing scientists, produced a political tension that journalists and opposition figures were quick to characterize as a fundamental contradiction between stated transparency commitments and operational institutional behavior. The FBI's classified consolidation of the cases meant that the official investigative record was no longer available to journalists, family members, or congressional staffers without specific security clearances and a formal need-to-know determination. This classification barrier created a secondary information vacuum that had the effect of concentrating public attention on the documented facts that were available while generating enormous speculative pressure about what the classified record contained. Attorneys representing family members of individuals in the consolidated investigation began filing Freedom of Information Act requests that were returned with the standard classification exemption responses. Congressional oversight requests from members of the relevant committees generated partial responses that described the existence of the investigation without providing its substantive findings. The operational details of what the FBI had determined about the pattern, about the specific mechanisms involved in each case, about any identified actors or institutional structures that might have produced the pattern, remained behind a classification wall that has not been breached as of the most recent available public record. The geographic distribution of the cases within the consolidated investigation spanned multiple states, with significant clustering in the Southwest, in the corridor running from New Mexico through Arizona and into Nevada, and secondary clustering in the Mid-Atlantic region, where multiple defense research institutions and intelligence community facilities are concentrated. This geographic pattern was consistent with the institutional geography of the specific research communities whose members were being affected. The Southwest clustering corresponded to the locations of facilities including Sandia National Laboratories, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the various military test ranges and research installations that constitute the physical infrastructure of America's most classified aerospace research programs. The Mid-Atlantic clustering corresponded to the contractor and intelligence community infrastructure that manages and funds those programs from office complexes in Virginia, Maryland, and the Greater Washington Corridor. The public commentary from the research and national security journalism communities in this period was characterized by a quality of urgency that is distinct from the normal register of investigative reporting on intelligence matters. Journalists who had spent years carefully building source relationships within the UAP disclosure advocacy community and who had developed sophisticated understandings of the institutional landscape they were covering were now describing what they were seeing in terms that went beyond normal professional caution. Several prominent researchers with documented access to primary sources within the military and intelligence communities described the pattern as representing an active threat to individuals with specific categories of knowledge and expressed personal concern about their own situations in ways that were publicly documented through social media posts, podcast appearances, and written communications to colleagues. The expressed fear was not about bureaucratic obstruction or classification challenges. It was about physical safety. That shift in the quality of concern from professional frustration to personal fear is itself a data point that the investigative record carries forward. The question of who or what could be responsible for a coordinated pattern of disappearances and deaths targeting individuals with specific classified knowledge has no publicly confirmed answer as of the record available through mid-2026. The range of hypotheses in serious circulation among investigators, journalists, and national security analysts encompasses domestic actors, whether institutional or rogue, operating within the American defense and intelligence establishment to prevent the disclosure of specific classified information. It encompasses foreign intelligence services with motivation and demonstrated capability to target American defense researchers. It encompasses the possibility, which cannot be responsibly dismissed in the absence of contradicting evidence, that the pattern is the product of convergent individual tragedies that share superficial but not causal connections. Each hypothesis carries evidentiary problems that prevent confident assignment. The domestic actor hypothesis requires explaining how such an operation could be conducted across multiple jurisdictions without generating the kind of operational debris that investigations typically surface. The foreign intelligence hypothesis requires explaining the specific, narrow targeting profile, which is too precisely configured around the UAP disclosure question to be obviously consistent with traditional espionage objectives. The convergent coincidence hypothesis requires accepting a clustering of anomalous events within an extremely specific professional community, across a compressed time window, with consistent evidentiary absences that strains the mathematical framework of coincidence to a degree that statisticians engaged by investigative organizations have formally documented as significant. William Neil McCasland, as of June 2026, has not been found. There has been no confirmed sighting, no contact with family, no financial transaction, no communication of any kind that has been publicly confirmed. The search operations that were conducted in the terrain surrounding Albuquerque produced no physical evidence. The federal investigation has not publicly disclosed any determination about his fate or his location. The 2-hour window between 10 a.m. and noon on February 27, 2026, remains an operational gap that no official source has filled with confirmed information. A 2-star general who commanded the most sensitive aerospace research laboratory in the American military inventory, who managed space-based weapons programs and the architecture of global navigation systems, who maintained active advisory relationships with the defense research community in the years following his retirement, who lived in a state of demonstrated awareness of his own digital footprint sufficient to strip every tracking device from his person before departing, walked out of his life in Albuquerque carrying a gun, a wallet, and a pair of hiking boots, and has not been seen since. The federal investigation that has consolidated his case with an undisclosed number of others involving researchers, scientists, and defense professionals in related fields is classified. Its findings are not publicly available. Its operational methods are not publicly described. Its conclusions, if it has reached any, are held behind clearance barriers that no journalist, no family member, and no congressional staffer without the appropriate access has been able to penetrate. What exists in the public record is the documented pattern, the timeline, the institutional profiles, the evidentiary anomalies, and the formal federal acknowledgement that these cases collectively constitute a matter of national security. The gap between internet speculation about what that pattern means and the terrifying weight of what a classified federal national security investigation into the disappearance of scientists with knowledge of America's most sensitive aerospace programs actually represents is not a gap that imagination fills. It is a gap that the institutional architecture of American national security has deliberately created and is actively maintaining. McCasland took his revolver into the desert, or into some other configuration of the world that no one in the public record can describe, and the government of the United States has classified what it knows about where he went and why. That is not speculation. That is the documented, confirmed, legally structured reality of the summer of 2026, and it demands to be understood for exactly what it is.